Alright, so this is going to be a follow-up video to my earlier video in which I was discussing incels and the rise and the phenomenon of inceldom. So for this video, I wanted to seg that into a different video in which I draw upon a slightly different theme, and that is the fact that our society, especially Western civilization, most Western countries do not, as a matter of principle, respect young men. Our society treats young men as though they are disposable. It is indifferent largely to young men's issues, and it often pits young women against men, and it tends to put women on a pedestal and treat women with kid gloves, basically. And in general, our society just does not care a fig for the issues and the plight affecting young men of today, and the incel phenomenon is just one notable example of this. So when I say that society does not respect young men, when I say society literally could not care less whether or not young men live or die, trust me when I say I'm not exaggerating, because we have a surprisingly little stake in the current modern world in which we live. And I'm going to go through the reasons as to why that is. First of all, the first way in which society doesn't respect young men is that men aren't allowed, and men and boys, by the way, aren't allowed to have their own spaces. I mean, there's so many examples of this. I mean, one of the more notable examples is that of the Boy Scouts of America. So, you know, for those of you who aren't aware, the Boy Scouts, it used to be an association which basically they'd get these young boys who had an appetite for adventure and exploring. They'd all go out exploring local woods and getting their bearings and becoming experienced and seasoned adventurers. It's the kind of thing that young men mostly enjoy, and you can see the connection that this kind of activity, scouting, would have with other disciplines which are often male-dominated, like being in the army or being in the police or being a frontiersman. Well, recently, I think there was a news article that I came across that said they're changing their name. They're no longer going to be called the Boy Scouts of America. They're going to change their name to the Scouting America, or something like that. So it's no longer the Boy Scouts. Now, keep in mind, they say that this is to rebrand their name and to make it more inclusive, but bear in mind that about 9 or 10 years ago, back in 2015, they already made the decision to allow girls into the Boy Scouts, which I think is ridiculous anyway. And then they later let in transgender people. So by that point, it could scarcely even be called the Boy Scouting Association of America. But there was also already a Girl Scouts of America as well. So what can we infer from this? It's quite simple. Boys aren't allowed to have anything exclusively for themselves. Anything that belongs to a boy or a man must necessarily also be the property of women and girls too. But you will find that that principle does not hold compared to women and girls. There's a double standard at play. Women are allowed to have their own personal spaces, girls are, but boys, not a chance. There are girls' book clubs. I mean, to give you an example, International Women's Day. I don't know exactly when the day is. I'm not saying that we shouldn't honor and respect the achievements and the contributions that women make to society, because society would not exist if we didn't have women. But what about International Men's Day? Are we going to have one of those? I mean, think about how society would look if all the men just disappeared. If there were no men left in the world, do you think society would last? Who would think of all the things, right, that men have done through history that most of us never think about, like toiling in the mines, working at oil rigs, fighting and dying in battle. It's true that there were women, for instance, who worked in the factories during the Second World War to produce munitions for the Allied powers, And there were many brave women who worked in hospitals to tend to the wounded, I think during Vietnam. But let's be realistic here. Was it women who stormed the beaches at Normandy? Was it American women who held up the flag at Iwo Jima? Was it women who were being drafted for the war in Vietnam? No, it was men who did all the fighting. It was the men who reaped the bulk of all the losses and the Purple Hearts. And our society likes to conveniently ignore this. The fact that it is most demanding share of the problems and responsibilities have always been weighted on the shoulders of men. So you would think that a society that was cognizant of this fact would at least have the decency to grant men the recognition and the personal space that they deserve. But no, men aren't given that recognition and honor. They're basically treated like doormats. Anything a man has must also belong to a woman. And drawing up from this on the theme of personal spaces, I think we can agree that the workplace itself used to be an example of a man's personal space, because it used to be the case that we lived in societies with very rigid gender roles, and these were recognized as the norm. It used to be the case that men would go and do work, men would work in the office, men would toil in the mines and do really rough, back-breaking labor and stuff like that, and work in the oil rigs. You know, a lot of people like to forget about how dangerous most male-dominated lines of industry are. But over time, that began to change, starting in the 1960s, and now more and more women have started to enter the workforce. And I don't think, to be honest, I don't think it's necessarily true that men are naturally against the idea of one or two women working in the industry, especially if they're qualified and good for the job. But what you tend to find happens is when a certain threshold of women entering the workforce is reached, you'll find that the culture begins to change. You'll find that the whole ethos of the workplace begins to shift in a different direction, where the environment begins to appeal more to feminine sensitivities. University, honestly, is a good example of this. When I think currently, as far as I'm aware, women are actually more likely to graduate from university than men. There's an imbalance. I think it's something like the ratio is 60-40. And you can see that universities have, over time, no longer become places of learning and of study and hard work. Now they're places where you're basically meant to follow and preach the dogma of what is essentially the modern day church. There are all these widely circulated myths and stories about LGBT oppression, women's rights, and the rape culture myth. Got back in 2015. God, I remember back then, that was when this whole rape culture campus myth was just beginning to take off. These stories were highly dubious. There was this woman who would go around carrying this mattress because she was apparently sexually assaulted. None of these women were ever properly challenged in a court of law. Their stories were never scrutinized. Basically, it became the case that you were either with the feminists or against them. You were with or against the patriarchy, and there were lots of casualties. I mean, think of the fallout from all this massive rise in false rape allegations, because many of them were literally false. I don't remember the exact statistics that they cited in their rape culture fantasy myth, but I remember looking at the figures that they were promulgating, thinking, my goodness, if this is true, then this means the average university college campus is more dangerous for young women than Cape Town in South Africa or Johannesburg. And obviously, something doesn't add up here. But that's the thing. And this is the kind of thing that could only be possible due to the fact that the universities are now predominantly occupied by women. This is the effect that women entering the workplace in large numbers tends to have. And this coincides with the fact that young men are losing ground. They are running out of spaces which we call men's spaces. In the UK, for instance, where I'm from, another example of this is the phenomenon of gentlemen's clubs. Now, for those of you who don't know, a gentlemen's club was essentially, it was a club for basically rich, aristocratic men who, it's very, very sleazy, aristocratic British aristocrat stuff. They would all gather in a room, smoke cigars, drink expensive champagne, and there'd be very attractive, beautiful young women wearing very little clothes. It's a bit of a euphemism for that kind of stuff. But anyway, that kind of stuff does appeal to a lot of men. But they abolished all the gentlemen's clubs. They abolished all the clubs where it was male admittance only. There's women's clubs that exist. Fuck knows what goes on in there. I don't even want to know. Probably they read poetry or some shit. But the phenomenon of gentlemen's clubs being relegated to the past, it's a sign that society will not let men have their own personal spaces. And there's another example, a tangential example of how society doesn't allow men to be themselves and relax in their own personal space is what we've seen in the entertainment industry. So I think one thing that we all intuitively know is that young men and young women, they tend to like different things, and these personality differences and these differences of interest, they manifest themselves in various ways. One example is in the realm of movies and fiction and entertainment. Girls tend to go for things like drama, romantic comedy, and chick flicks, because girls are more emotionally expressive, and they like stuff that that expounds upon the human, or the gamut of human feelings. But boys are a bit different. Boys like things with action, with guns, explosions, and stuff like that. Science fiction, especially, is something that appeals a lot more to the male brain than it does to women. And there were lots of great science fiction movie franchises that used to exist, like, for instance, Back to the Future, the Terminator, Ghostbusters, Indiana Jones. But slowly, what we've begun to see over the past few decades is that a lot of the classic movie franchises, which used to basically be seen as the prerogative and the mainstay of young male enjoyment, because it was what a lot of young men grew up with, they've been taken over and they've been hijacked and commandeered by feminists. The earliest example of this that I'm aware of, is the Ghostbusters movie. Does anyone remember that god-awful Ghostbusters movie remake in 2016? What did they do? They took all the classic male characters in Ghostbusters, Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, Harold Ramis, and Ernie Hudson, and what did they do? They replaced them with women and a transgender man. And, well, the box office results speak for themselves. I think I speak for everyone when I say, honestly, nobody liked that movie. I didn't watch it. I'd seen other people's takes on it, and honestly, I have no plan to watch that movie. You couldn't pay me enough. And this was in spite of the fact that everywhere you go, it was being promoted. I remember, actually, funnily enough, at the time, I was in New York. I was in New York City. I was doing a bit of sightseeing, and I remember they plastered the movie posters everywhere you looked. They really wanted you to see this pile of shit. But no thanks. I did not give in to their temptation, because it was exactly what you would expect. It's like, if you saw the trailer, you instantly knew whether it was going to be for you or not, and I wasn't having any of it. And keep in mind, the Ghostbusters movie is not the Ghostbusters franchise is just one example. There's so many others. One of the more notorious examples is with Lucasfilm and the Star Wars movie franchise. Now, I used to freaking love Star Wars. I tell you that. The Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, It's a great movie. That was the first movie I ever watched in the cinema. I was 4 years old at the time. It was my 4th birthday. I have so many positive memories because my dad, he took me out to a nice little breakfast diner, and I got a Naboo starfighter toy. I have so many good memories of that. And I don't care what people say, the prequels were awesome. You know, always. Maybe this is because of my bias of recollection, because episodes 1 to 3 were the ones that I grew up watching. But anyway, episodes 1 to 6, honestly, most people don't seem to have a problem. But then episode 7 came out in, I think it was 2014 or 2015, and they introduced a new character, Rey Palpatine. Now, to be honest, I don't think most people would have necessarily had a problem with there being a female Jedi, but Rey Palpatine wasn't just a female Jedi. She was what we colloquially refer to in the entertainment and industry and in fiction as a Mary Sue, because she had all the strengths of a Jedi Master, but none of the weaknesses. There were all these crazy things that she could do with very little effort that would have normally taken a male Jedi a lot more time. This it's no accident that they decided to do this, because at the time, Lucasfilm, George Lucas, the guy who founded the company, the brains behind the Star Wars operation, he'd resigned from Lucasfilm, and he handed the reins to, who did he hand the reins to? Kathleen Kennedy, a bitter man-hating feminist who wanted to fight the patriarchy. And so she decided to subvert a goldmine of intellectual property and turn it into woke garbage. And Rey Palpatine wasn't the only female girl boss in there. There were countless others, but honestly, I haven't watched episode 7 to 9. All I did was I watched the Critical Drinker's review of those movies, and I honestly have no plans to go anywhere near that. There's so many other examples. Then there's the Indiana Jones movie franchise. Last year, they had a new Indiana Jones movie, Indiana Jones and the Diarrhea of Destiny. And they threw in another Mary Sue character who's super cool and talented and good looking, and she outmaneuvers Indiana Jones on his own adventures, even though we'd literally never seen or heard her before. It's a recognizable pattern that we've been seeing more and more of as time goes on. Hollywood just isn't learning from its mistakes. And you might think I'm being judgmental and generalizing when I say this, but I can assure you I'm not. The box office results do bear this out. No one likes these movies. Nobody likes these shitty films. The box office results are proof enough. All of them, without exception, have been a flop, a colossal failure, because these movies don't appeal to anyone. Young men certainly aren't enchanted by these films. These movies are an insult to them. They've taken everything that the young men grew up with and grew to love and tossed it in the trash and replaced it with feminist garbage. And I don't even think women like these films either, because women aren't that interested in science fiction in the first place. But it's a very specific subset of women who are more likely to be interested in these movies that is in no way commensurate to the actual box office market. Basically, these movies, they weren't made to succeed. And I think that Kathleen Kennedy must have known this from the start. They were made basically to rub men's face in the new messaging, you know, just to mock and deride young men for having their own interest. Because, as I've said before, society has no respect for young men. And I hate to hammer this point home, but could you imagine what would happen, right, if there'd been a takeover or a studio company merger where, you know, that franchise Gossip Girl, or what is it that young women enjoy? Gossip Girl or Friends, or I don't know, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. They made a remake of that, and instead of it all being a bunch of young women, or Sex and the City, or Golden Girls, and instead of it being a bunch of young women talking about all their dating lives or who's the new man who come into the office, instead it was about a bunch of massive lesbians with huge tits who wore no clothes and were all just making out with each other all the time, and there were these guns and explosions and aliens taking over the galaxy. Can you see? And imagine if all the young men who suddenly found that they really enjoyed these films, imagine if they pointed and said, hey, we were always fans of Gossip Girl. We were here from the beginning, you sexist trolls. As you can imagine, that would probably never happen, and it would go down like a lead balloon. But the point I'm making still stands. There has been a self-conscious takeover of and a hijacking of young men's personal spaces. I don't exaggerate when I say this all filters in with what I've said earlier, that society does not allow young men to have their own personal space because society does not respect young men. And in a climate and in a context like this, with the circumstances the way they are, it is little wonder that society does not recognize or have any pity or sympathy for the incels and their plight. I'm probably going to have to drag this out and make a part 3 because I got to run off and do my collection. But there's more that I got to say about this. So stick around for part 3 because it's going to come. And I got plenty more to say about that. See you later.